David, just to give us a a little bit of a take about what you do, what your firm does, kind of things that you do, and so on. Just a bit of a background base.
Mostly do law for people, a lot of property and very specialist property. Most of my work relates to residential landlord and tenant stuff, usually fairly complex things, and particularly at the moment, lots of crime work and defending landlords from prosecutions by local authorities and the fire service and people like that, where I'm one of the only people actually doing it, and so far doing reasonably well. Can
you share with us some conveyancing stories, maybe a particular story that comes to mind?
If you're buying a property, the land registry will allow you to put a free restriction on the property to say that nothing can happen to it without a signed certificate from a conveyancer who will verify your identity first. Costs you nothing. So I can't recommend that enough to people. Often when people buy properties from conveyancers who don't know enough about residential property for investment, they don't put these restrictions on there, because obviously you wouldn't do it for your own home, but if you're buying as an investment, you need restrictions and protection. It is really easy for a tenant to take control of your identity, because all you have to do is fail to redirect one bank statement or one utility bill, and from then they start building a web of control, and before you know it, they've borrowed £50,000 on your property, and you've got to go and convince that loan company that it wasn't you. And bear in mind, when loan companies start to call in loans, the first thing everybody tells them is, it wasn't me. So they're bound to not believe you. It's not because they think you're lying, it's because that's what everybody else is doing. So they start from a position of distrust. So it can be really difficult to sort it out.
So a little bit about conveyancing. What other kind of, when you're dealing with investors, what other kind of challenges or cases do you come across that you think might be useful to everybody here that's listening in, that they can be aware of?
Yeah, the biggest challenges at the moment are obviously around evicting tenants, because the situation is getting more and more complex. Section 21 is not the easy standby that many people used to find it to be. There's a lot more hoops you have to jump through. There's a particular concern at the moment with the requirement to serve gas safety certificates. There's been some recent cases, and most of you will know, if you haven't given the tenant a gas safety certificate, you now can't serve a Section 21 under the new regime, which is a bit of a problem, because then your only other option is to wait for the tenant to go into rent arrears before you can evict them, which is not a great start from an investment point of view. And the other big area that I spend a lot of time on at the moment is various types of prosecution. It's important to bear in mind that more and more and more local authorities, particularly in London, but also heavily in the Midlands, are looking at licensing, whether that's licensing of houses of multiple occupation or licensing of all landlords in a specific area.
What do you think when it comes to licensing? Is it really that drastic, or is it manageable? Is it something that we investors, should we all, is it game over for everybody just because licenses come in, or do you think actually, if we take a prudent approach, it can work? What are your thoughts?
Well, I tend to be quite positive about these things. I see almost all of these things as an opportunity, not a negative. The problem I tend to find with licensing with HMOs is people who do it a little bit and dabble in it and think that doing an HMO is just like a house with a few extra people in it. If you want to do good quality HMOs, for example, then do HMOs, have a set of processes and procedures that are directed at managing an HMO and that will make you comply with the law. So as with most things in life these days, it's about risk mitigation, risk reduction, and having a strong process. If you're involved in property investment in a regulated sector like HMOs or licensing, I would advise you to do it through a limited company, because it insulates you a little bit from the situation. Obviously there's difficulties then potentially with finance, but they are surmountable. But the limited company will then be prosecuted, and you can be prosecuted as a director, but most local authorities won't bother, or it's easier to get out of it. And then it's not you personally, and obviously having a criminal offence registered on your name is kind of embarrassing when you want to go and become a teacher or a Cub Scout leader or something like that. Whereas a company, it's just a company, change the name, who cares? Well, obviously you should care, but still, it's not great. But then also strong processes. That means regular management inspections, making sure the tenants aren't moving in 5 people and turning it into an HMO behind your back. I see lots and lots of landlords who just don't inspect their properties at all. And then when the local authority says, well, I'm going to prosecute you because it's now an HMO with 8 people living there, they say, well, how was I supposed to know? Well, the answer is because you're supposed to inspect the property. So regular process, good process, strong property inspections, and bearing in mind that if you're running an HMO, you can be prosecuted for broken cupboards, for disrepair, for a dripping tap, and they will prosecute for that stuff.
So, having those inspections going on, on a regular basis is so important, because you can nip so many things in the bud. You know, just like David's saying. So if you've got more people living there that shouldn't be living there, you can address that straight away. You can bring that to your tenant's attention. If there's that leaky tap or something that's in disrepair or whatever it is, you can straight away deal with that maintenance while it's a small issue. So this is the thing. I mean, you've heard me say it so many times before. You know, property is pretty simple. It's not that complicated, but we need to do the right things. We need to be aware of what we need to do, and you can make it work. So, you know, that'd be my take on it.
Yeah.
So,
and on inspection, I would certainly make sure your inspections are structured and provable. I meet lots of clients who say, "Oh, but I inspected," and you're like, "Well, when?" And they don't really remember. So if you're doing inspections, an email chain where you email the tenants and say, "I'm coming round to inspect." If you find something wrong, like there's bicycles in the hallway making it a fire safety hazard, there's an email that says, "Please remove the bicycles from the hallway. I'll be back next week to check." One of the problems sometimes with property investment is people's business model is just to buy property and accrete whatever comes along. That's not really a business model. But for example, investing in properties that are HMOs with local housing allowance tenants is probably not a very good business model in London, because local housing allowance doesn't meet market rent. If you go to the South Coast, it's a very workable business model because the benefits level is at or above local market rent. So it's about picking a business model that's sensible, that works for you as well, of course, and that fits the local area, not trying to beat the local area into submission and create a faux business model that just happens to work because you want it to. And it's really important, and one of the things I know Kam talks about a lot is having a business model that's sustainable and works across your portfolio, and not just buying property because it's there.
So David, I know you work quite a lot, very closely with the government and with all the sort of larger bodies like the NLA and the RLA and so on. So from a solicitor's perspective, from what you're doing, what do you see coming in with legislation? How, what are your sort of viewpoints on legislation? How do you see it changing?
Obviously, I'm immensely biased in that, to some extent, lawyers like more legislation because it's kind of, it makes work for us, but we like decent quality legislation. I think one of the problems at the moment, and this will continue to be a problem, is the government's not engaged in a strategic think about property. It's reacting to headlines. It's what you might choose to call, it's headline government. So if it's in the Sun or the Daily Mail or the right newspaper and it's big enough, then bam, you're going to get some legislation about it. So tenant fees, for example, people think tenant fees has gone quiet. I can assure you it hasn't. The tenant fees bill will be passed. There is now legislative time in there for it. It's going to happen. That obviously means if you're using a managing agent, the chances are your agency fees are going to have to go up, because managing agents have to make money as well. And most managing agents make a significant proportion of their income out of tenant fees. So that's going to change the market dynamic quite a lot. The government's very, very keen on increasing regulation in the sector, but they're not keen on rewriting the whole Housing Act 1988. But for example, they're proposing to require all landlords to have electrical safety inspections. That will probably come into force in October. If it doesn't, early April next year. They've gone through all the motions for that now. There's another consultation on it just now. It will almost certainly end up being linked to Section 21. So Section 21 is a bit of a target area from the government. They're not likely at the moment to get rid of it altogether, but they're going to keep bolting on more and more little hoops on top of it until it becomes almost unworkable as a system. There's also a big consultation and a very serious discussion about having some kind of housing ombudsman that all landlords will be legally obliged to join if they don't have an agent who's a member. So there's a potential cost there. And of course, in some ways, a silly cost, because the reality is if you go and look at the ombudsman for letting agents at the moment, they basically get no complaints from tenants whatsoever. All of their complaints are from landlords.
What sort of main pointers are you looking out for?
The first thing I point out with rent to rent is that people get very stuck into the standard AST model, i.e. the landlord does all the repairs and the tenant doesn't do anything. And I actually point out to people that it's a much more flexible position. It's essentially a commercial letting between the landlord and the intermediate tenant who's subletting on. And it allows you to put really good USPs in place. You can turn to landlords and say, well, we'll pay you a fixed amount and we'll handle gas safety certificates, or we'll do repairs up to a certain value, or we'll redecorate the property between tenants. And it actually allows a much more flexible range of much more interesting business models to enter the market, as opposed to the basic model, which is I let to a tenant, I do all the repairs and I keep the property nice, and the tenant hopefully doesn't trash it too much. I think rent to rent and those kind of things make that much more interesting. And of course, the other thing they do, of course, is they take properties that realistically it's really hard to find tenants for. It's great that there are 5-bed houses in parts of Stratford, but the reality is, who can afford a 5-bed house in Stratford today? It's a very, very small number of people, whereas you can get 5 people who can get together and rent rooms. And again, this is a difficulty the government and local authorities just don't want to wake up to. The fact is, property isn't really suitable for the way people want it. Rent-to-rent's a good way of taking larger properties and making them more suitable for what people actually want. You're servicing the market.